Chinese are building gigawatt reactors for $6 billion each. We could cut the front-end cost, the capital cost of nuclear power generation in the United States from $28 billion to $6 billion. The Chinese government has used the Chinese banks as conduits of below-market capital for Chinese companies. The consequence of that is that they've grown world-scale businesses in 30 years. Cost of capital is more like 6.75. To the extent that a Chinese firm does it and borrows through Industrial Commercial Bank of China, that same loan costs 3.5%. The downside, the disutility of mistakes wasn't socialized, but rather was kept private. And then changed the tax code to make it competitive with Japan, Korea, China, Sweden, Denmark. We wouldn't even be having these discussions. Eliminated regulatory roadblocks. And we were affirmative in terms of what we expected with regards to resource development, eliminating the export of deleterious materials and standardizing safety designs across reactors, across refineries. Friend in the BLM who I've known a very long standing, and he said, Rick, if you want to get something done, you got 2 years.
Are you seeing similar, and is this kind of making you more excited going forward just because there's more skin in the game now for the world's governments behind a lot of these things?
Both more and less excited. As a taxpayer, I'm horrified.
Mm-hmm.
As somebody who's been an investor in the space for a long time, the idea that a bunch of dumb money comes behind me, and there's no money as dumb as government money, is attractive. But I really am of mixed opinion. I am certain that the government's application of capital will be a misapplication. There's zero doubt about that. It won't be based on the risk-adjusted net present value and the probabilities of return on capital employed. It will be based on what will generate the most votes for the people who cause it to occur. In other words, there will be a non-economic transaction that takes place. I look at my own experience 7 years ago during the Biden administration. People like me who were advocates of U.S. uranium were likely to find their picture on a post office wall. Now, these same guys who vilified us want to subsidize us.
Right.
I need to say, Adam, I felt cleaner when I was on the post office wall than being subsidized, but I certainly understand that there's no money in the world the mining industry likes as much as dumb money. And the dumb money is literally cascading down into the business now. So in terms of the return on capital employed that will be enjoyed by smart money that was front-running the dumb money, these are wonderful times.
Government money rarely rewards taxpayers, yet it often rewards investors positioned early. Rick Rule notes that political capital usually follows headlines instead of disciplined capital allocation. Creating distortions smart investors can anticipate. Markets often misprice these policy-driven shifts before institutions fully reposition. Those protecting long-term wealth should watch where subsidies appear, not where politicians speak. Next, Rick Rule exposes why government-backed investment booms often conceal opportunities retail investors recognize far too late.
Okay.
Mountain Pass is an example. In our former domicile, California, received a massive government grant. In my lifetime, that deposit has been bankrupt 3 times. So as a taxpayer, I'm horrified. As a speculator, I'm delighted.
Okay. So thank you for offering that validation, which is if you are an investor in this space and you can figure out where the dumb money is going and get in front of it, it can be a huge tailwind for you. I also told a little story, which I'll keep really brief here, but I was at a social event here in Nevada where I live with a mining CEO. He runs mines, even though he lives here in Nevada, he runs mines up in Idaho. And they've got a lot of, I called it antimony, but I guess it's antimony. I think I heard you pronounce correctly. So they've got a lot of antimony, and the government has approached him and said, look, we're really trying to help increase the nation's antimony production. And they're like aggressively throwing grant money at him. And they have these, I guess, budgetary deadlines where it's got to be spent by. So, he's basically saying they're kind of making my life a living hell because I got to get all this stuff ready to be able to qualify for this grant, but they're just shoving it down my throat. And sure, I'll take it.
A mine that failed repeatedly suddenly becomes strategic once governments start writing checks. According to Rick Rule, investors should pay closer attention to where grant money is urgently flowing than to optimistic policy speeches. Institutions understand that capital allocation often signals priorities before public narratives catch up. Ignoring those signals can leave portfolios behind major commodity cycles. Next, Rick Rule reveals why political urgency often appears only after years of missed investment opportunities.
To your point, there's a real urgency behind this. And of course, when the government has that type of urgency, you can make sure that they're not really dotting all their I's and crossing all their T's.
And this was, of course, after spending 13 years in needless permitting activities before they decided to subsidize him. I mean, the juxtaposition now and then is striking. And I need to say that the United States permitting regime had to become more practical and less political. It had to be about not doing harm, as opposed to satisfying the sort of woke personalities of some elites. And that has begun to happen. I have a friend in the BLM who I've known a very long standing, and he said, Rick, if you want to get something done, you got 2 years.
Oh, okay. Just in case there's a administration shift. Okay, so here's where we're getting to my second question. But to segue into it, I'll go back to your nuclear points, Rick. I have been very heartened, and I don't follow this nearly as much as you have, but I've been very heartened about the alacrity by which the current administration, appears to be pivoting the government from complete opposition against any innovation in nuclear or anything in nuclear to, oh my gosh, we've got to, basically engineer a domestic nuclear renaissance as fast as we can, right? You're nodding as I'm saying this. And so, the government, when it puts its mind to it, can be a real enabler.
Policy reversals often matter more than policy announcements because they expose what officials suddenly fear. What Rick Rule is highlighting is that years of permitting delays are being replaced by urgency, suggesting strategic shortages have become impossible to ignore. History shows governments accelerate approvals only after supply problems become unavoidable. Investors waiting for unanimous optimism usually arrive after the strongest gains. Next, Rick Rule unravels why the nuclear policy pivot carries a contradiction few analysts discuss.
And provide a real tailwind to industry and commerce. And I think what's going on in the nuclear industry right now is a great example of that, where they're slashing regulation as fast as they can, hopefully still preserving essential safety elements. But they're really driving a ton of innovation that's going on there. And I've interviewed some really interesting companies on this channel of late, like in the micro nuclear reactor space. Super fascinating. So when I told this story on the stage about the non-markets class at Yahoo and the fact that investors really need to be aware that the government is stepping in and I'll say, creating winners and losers, but I think the intent is to try to create more winners in some key sectors for the economy. Adrian Day then sort of went on a tirade that I very much agreed with mostly, which was, he was all for the government kind of getting friction out of the way of commerce, but at the same time completely opposed to the state taking an equity stake in major companies. Said, look, that's just the basis for socialism and eventually communism. I mean, that's state control. He got pretty much a standing O from the audience, which I participated in. But I asked him afterwards. I said, Adrian, like, where do you? And I don't know the answer to this. This is really an open question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Governments claim to support free markets while increasingly deciding which industries deserve capital. Rick Rule's argument suggests that reducing regulatory friction strengthens competition, but direct ownership fundamentally changes how markets allocate risk. That distinction rarely appears in mainstream economic debates, despite its long-term consequences. Wealth preservation depends on recognizing when incentives quietly become control. Next, Rick Rule exposes where market support ends and state influence quietly begins.
Where is the line? Like, in other words, if it wasn't an equity stake in a company, but it was a favorable loan, or a grant, that's trying to accelerate a national objective. For example, we want to create X amount of incremental, nuclear electrical production by a certain date. Does the government have a role to play to try to provide incentives or help companies get there? Where is that line between being an enabler and stepping into state control?
I don't think that it's the government's business to pick winners and losers.
Hmm.
If the government removed the obstacles, here's an example. Uh, the last U.S. reactor that was built, a big reactor, a gigawatt reactor, cost with delays and customization about $29 billion. The
Can you just give the
Chinese,
time on that? When was that? Was that like in the 70s?
oh, no, no, it was just completed a year and a
Oh,
half ago,
okay.
2 years ago. The Chinese are building gigawatt reactors for $6 billion each
Hmm.
because they build 10 at a clip of the same kind.
Right.
They aren't required to be re-engineered for local political preference.
Yeah.
To the extent that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission enabled the development of a single American prototype, which could be permitted on a cookie cutter basis and could be assembled, we could cut the cost, the front end cost, the capital cost of nuclear power generation in the United States from $28 billion to $6 billion.
The biggest cost to investors is often regulation disguised as protection. This is where Rick Rule's thesis shifts from subsidies towards structural efficiency, arguing standardized permitting could dramatically reduce nuclear construction costs. Lower capital costs strengthen entire industries without government selecting corporate winners. Investors should watch policy reforms that improve economics rather than temporary funding programs. Next, Rick Rule reveals the overlooked tax advantage making foreign markets more competitive than America.
Hmm.
Our technology is as good as the Chinese, but the Chinese get to employ it a lot, so they tweak it better and better and better.
Right.
Getting out of the way is the first thing the United States could do.
Sure.
The second thing the United States could do that wouldn't cost the United States any direct money would be to change the tax code. Make it as investor friendly as the Chinese tax code, or for that matter, the Swedish or the Danish tax code.
Hmm.
If you and I were to build a nuclear power plant in Denmark or in China, the concrete shell of the building, we could depreciate for tax purposes in 5 years, including against other income. In the United States, we would depreciate that via straight line for 30 years.
Okay. Hmm.
To the extent that the U.S. tax code became more investor friendly and less consumer centric, most of the competitive disadvantage that we face versus other countries would be eliminated. It's important to note that the some of the countries that the political class likes so much, the Nordic countries, have much more investment-centric tax codes than the United States. So to the extent that we eliminated regulatory roadblocks and we were affirmative in terms of what we expected with regards to resource development, eliminating the export of deleterious materials and standardizing safety designs across reactors, across refineries. And I would further advocate something that the industry would hate, front-end environmental bonding for all resource and extractive activities in the United States.
America's technology isn't necessarily losing. Its incentives increasingly are. Rick Rule notes that tax policy and permitting can determine competitiveness long before engineering becomes the deciding factor. Capital consistently flows toward jurisdictions offering predictable returns instead of political uncertainty. Investors focused only on commodity prices may overlook the policies shaping tomorrow's production capacity. Next, Rick Rule exposes why environmental accountability and investor incentives can coexist without contradiction.
Okay.
So that the downside, the disutility of mistakes wasn't socialized, but rather was kept private. And then change the tax code to make it competitive with Japan, Korea, China, Sweden, Denmark. We wouldn't even be having these discussions.
Okay. Well, that's a great list. And I mean, hopefully, I don't know, hopefully maybe we're starting to get there. But basically what I take from you, Rick, is I mean, the government is going to favor different industries just based upon what it deems is in the national interest. But your point is okay, so remove the friction within that industry first, Second, enable the inflow of capital into that industry, but largely from a private source, and it's not directed to a particular set of companies on a favorable basis. It's just let the free market decide where that private capital should go.
Certainly, with regards to resource investments, Rick Rule would prefer allocated Rick Rule's capital
Hmm.
to having Donald Trump or some senator who arguably knows an awful lot less about resources than I do allocate my capital for me.
Okay. Well, hopefully, some of the influential minds there in politics listen more closely to the Rick rules. But the reality right now is that there's just a lot of money flowing out of that, DC and into these industries. And as a natural resources investor, I'm going to speak for Rick Rule for a second. There's all sorts of reasons to be excited about investing in these natural resources for reasons of underinvestment and future demand and all that type of stuff.
Private capital usually allocates resources more efficiently than political agendas ever can. According to Rick Rule, governments should remove barriers while allowing competitive markets to determine which businesses ultimately succeed. That separation becomes increasingly important as strategic industries attract larger public funding commitments. Investors benefit most when policy expands opportunity, instead of choosing favorites. Next, Rick Rule reveals why cheap government-backed financing creates advantages impossible for private competitors to match.
But then there's the additional reason of, hey, right. there's a gravy train of liquidity flowing into this. Put yourself ahead of it.
Right. And the impact of that, a cynic could say, has been seen in China. The Chinese government have used the Chinese banks as conduits of below market capital for Chinese companies. And the consequence of that is that they've grown world scale businesses in 30 years. I'm not in favor of that, but if a non-investment grade company goes to build a gold mine, the loan on the construction loan is likely to cost them between 13 and 15% per annum. To the extent that an investment grade company does that can borrow on balance sheet, that cost of capital is more like 6.75. To the extent that a Chinese firm does it and borrows through Industrial Commercial Bank of China, that same loan costs 3.5%. So for one of the independent miners that you would have seen at my conference, the sort of go-golds of the world, the Eris minings of the world, mm-hmm. Their cost of capital for construction is somewhere between 13 and 15%. Zijin's cost of capital is 3.5%.
Wow.
Cheap capital quietly wins commodity cycles long before production numbers make headlines. What Rick Rule is highlighting is that financing costs can determine which miners dominate global supply, regardless of geology alone. A company borrowing at 3.5% competes under entirely different economics than one paying 4 times more. Portfolio returns increasingly depend on understanding capital advantages before earnings reflect them. Next, Rick Rule exposes why the real commodity battle is being fought through financing, not drilling.
If we can de-escalate, that is to say, if clear heads ultimately do prevail, and if they can prevail within sort of the 10-day time frame, we'll duck the consequences. There are still reasonable reserves, strategic reserves in places like China, Japan, and the United States. Places that couldn't afford reserves, like Sri Lanka and Pakistan, they're already behind the 8 ball. Mm-hmm. They're already behind the 8 ball. But it's important to know that the increase in oil prices that we've seen is as a consequence of the threat of a shortage as opposed to an actual shortage. If we come into an actual shortage and you ration oil by price, I don't know what that price will be, but it'll be much higher. In North America, we will be less existentially impacted because we produce lots of oil. Adam Taggart will go to the pump, look at the price, use some improper English, fill his car, and drive away. A taxi cab driver in Colombo, in Sri Lanka, looks at that higher price and he parks his cab.
Right.
He stops. Right. So it really depends on who you are. Looking
in theory too, if our national reserves got low enough, we could theoretically stop exporting, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we would. The political impact of providing crude to the world when Americans couldn't drive, I think, would be very, very high. And I think
Yeah.
the President and Congress would agree on that.
Markets often react to the fear of shortages long before shortages actually exist. Rick Rule's argument suggests perceived scarcity can reprice energy immediately, while genuine supply disruptions produce far greater economic consequences. Wealth preservation requires separating geopolitical headlines from underlying physical inventories. Investors confusing temporary panic with structural scarcity risk making expensive decisions. Next, Rick Rule reveals why today's energy anxiety may be masking a far bigger long-term supply problem.
That hides, though, I think, an important part of the conference, which is to say that the shortage of oil that we're experiencing today is artificial and temporary. It has to do with war. The shortage that we're facing late 29, early 2030 is structural.
Because we didn't explore and drill for it back in 2019 or 2009, right?
It's a consequence of 30 years of underinvestment, but in particular, 3 years of the industry deferring sustaining capital investments to the extent of about $1 billion a year. This doesn't necessarily impact you in year one or year two or year three, but it impacts you in the out years. And that structural imbalance, the structural shortage, isn't something that can be cured with an armistice. It's something that has to be cured with massive capital investments over a fairly long period of time. The point of this is that the price escalation that you've seen in oil in calendar 2026 is really a preview of things to come. The difficulty is that the ability to correct that imbalance, the probability of correcting that imbalance in a reasonable time frame is much lower when the shortage is due to structural rather than artificial reasons.
Temporary crises dominate headlines, but structural shortages reshape entire investment cycles. This is where Rick Rule's thesis shifts toward decades of underinvestment that cannot be reversed with ceasefires or political agreements. Long-term commodity inflation often begins years before supply constraints become obvious to the public. Investors ignoring structural deficits risk protecting yesterday's portfolio instead of tomorrow's purchasing power.